Lydia Thorpe is only the ninth ever First Nations senator to be elected to the Australian Federal Parliament. The member of the Australian Greens was required to take an oath of allegiance to the Queen before she could take her seat, and this is what happened next.
Senator Thorpe, please come to the table to make and subscribe the affirmation of allegiance.
Senator Thorpe, please recite the affirmation on the card handed to you.
I, Sovereign Lydia Thorpe, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and I bear true allegiance to the colonising Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Senator Thorpe, I'm going to wait for quiet. Senator Thorpe, you are required to recite the oath as printed on the card, so please recite the oath.
None of us like it.
Senator Thorpe, order.
I, Lydia Thorpe, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law.
Senator Thorpe, please sign the test roll and Senator's roll.
I love, I think deliberately mispronouncing heirs is sort of like a sign of disrespect. I mean, more significantly, you heard in the background there other senators calling on Thorpe to have some respect, which is, it is a bit much, isn't it, coming from a group of people jeering someone wanting to commemorate their ancestors who were subject to genocide. But Thorpe's statement has received more support on social media, and she's been interviewed around the world, including on Times Radio.
Well, I just stated a fact that the Queen and what the Queen represents is colonisation. And colonisation in this country, in Australia, has done so much damage to First Nations people, to Indigenous people right across this country. They are responsible for genocide. So, yes, colonisation murdered and raped Indigenous people when they came here with their boats. And I felt, as going into the Senate, into the Parliament, that swearing allegiance to a colonising queen of another country who created so much harm to this country's First People was demoralising, and it was the wrong thing to do. It didn't feel right in my heart, and a lot of Indigenous people in Australia do not subscribe to being colonised. It took away our livelihoods. It took away our language, song, dance. It took away the essence of who we are as Indigenous people in this country. So to be made to swear allegiance to someone else's queen of someone else's country is ludicrous.
It is ludicrous. British settler colonisers were massacring First Nations people from the late 18th century all the way into the 20th century. Most massacres were planned and carried out by white civilians, but nearly half were conducted by agents of the state. Until 1901, those would have been agents of Great Britain. And that's only the massacres that we know about. Before Britain invaded Australia, the First Nations population is thought to have been somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million people. By 1900, there were fewer than 100,000. It was only in 1969 that the Australian government repealed laws giving them the right to remove First Nations children from their families permanently. But if you're from a First Nations background and you're not willing to give an uncritical allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen, you get jeers, in the Australian Parliament.
Sometimes when moments like this happen, I find it really helpful to actually just strip back all of the noise, strip back all of the context, and just think about what is actually happening here. So what you have is you have a group of people who have been living on a territory for more than 70,000 years. Then another group of people come and steal that territory, commit genocide, and the few who survive that are subjected to some of the most dispossessing and oppressive policies in recent history, including stealing children from their parents and sending them to schools where they can be robbed of their language and their culture. You ban them from, as Lydia talked about in that segment, from speaking their language, from enjoying their culture. You deny them the right to vote in a system that you have imposed on them. You force them to integrate into that system that deliberately puts them at the bottom of every possible hierarchy you can think of. And then when a member of that community is finally able to be part of that system as a representative, a system that, by the way, has systematically dispossessed her community and her ancestors, you then ask her to show you respect. You're not being polite enough to your colonizer, is what they're saying to her. And even though we have put you in a position where you are forced to be part of a system that hates you, because otherwise you'll have absolutely no recourse to representation. And so when you think about what you are asking Indigenous people to tolerate, and what you, as the state, as the colonial state, the settler colonial state in that country, what you are refusing to tolerate, it is like the most unbelievable double standard that I can't even believe that it isn't ridiculed in every newspaper. And the last thing I want to say on this, and this is what always happens when we have these conversations, is that you say that we, as people who have been colonized either by settler colonial states or by non-settler colonial states, you say that we are the ones who are rewriting history in order to suit our sensitivities, and that we are the ones who are over obsessed with language over substantive issues. And yet you are the one who can't stand it when someone is simply naming history for what it is and naming your role in that history. So who is actually here rewriting history to suit their snowflake sensibilities? Is it Lydia Thorpe, who is having to participate in a system that, as I said, dispossesses her and her community in order to try and get some representation for that community, who is having to withstand the normalization of a system that has done untold things to those like her, and who is simply naming the colonizer a colonizer? Or is it the colonizer who can't bear to be confronted with who they have historically been, and quite frankly, as we saw in that footage, who they continue to be? So whenever these things happen, I always just think to myself, how have they managed to switch the idea of rewriting history and snowflake sensibilities to cast us in that position, when this entire thing is a scandal because they cannot bear to actually be told the truth about the history that not only the Australian state and obviously the British state has been part of, but actually the system that is being perpetuated and continued to this very day.